Hey, it's Drybear. We're continuing our starter guide series for World of Warcraft with the Death Knight. This is a guide for people that are switching over to Death Knight as a new class, or they're coming back to the game and they want to be reacquainted with how things work. As a starter guide, I'll talk about leveling. I'll give you a spec that you can import for each one of your specs in the game, a talent build that you can import for leveling, and we'll get you to level 70 and give you the basics of how the class works. If you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every single day on twitch.tv. So head on over there. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them while I'm live during the day. So let's jump into starter guide for Death Knight. Death Knight is your plate class. It was actually, I think, the first class that we got originally. And it was super unique. It has 2 damage specs, Unholy and Frost, and it has a tank spec, Blood. And from then, it's probably one of the slower classes in the game. You only really have Death's Advance to get you going, and then if you run Wraithwalk, you can have that as well, which is nice, but for the most part, they are relatively slow. So if you're someone that likes more strategic thinking, planning, and using the right abilities at the right time, and resource management, maybe Death Knight's for you. They have some of the most interesting and fun gameplay in the game. So great choice, but do know that if you're caught out, you don't have any big leaps or charges or dashes, and for the most part, you're just going to be walking back and forth. Generally with tank, everything's going to come to you anyway, so it's not a huge deal, but Frost and Holy kind of have to put their feet to the work. Now, as I said, Blood is the tank spec, so if you're looking to spank and tank, Blood is going to be the way to go. Unholy is very summon focused. They summon a lot of minions, and they use those to deal damage, and they have lots of really cool necrotic effects. They have kind of a corpse explosion where they put on festering wounds, then detonate those and do big damage. Really cool to see. When everything lines up well for Unholy, it's very fun to see all the numbers all over your screen. And Frost is generally a little bit faster than Unholy. Typically, it's been 2 one-handers for the longest time, but in this expansion, we do have 2-handers back, which is nice. So that's super cool, but if you like between these two, definitely gonna pick it up. So what we're going to do for this is I'm going to give you some builds that you can import directly into your game for each of the specs. But first, we're going to talk about general Death Knight class effects, abilities, pros and cons, and then we'll go through the class tree. If you didn't know, in Dragonflight, we got a new talent tree. The left tree is your class tree. This is the same for the most part with minor changes between all 3 of the specs. So this one will basically be the same for all of them. And then the right talent tree is your spec talent tree. So for all 3 of these, they're going to have more or less this, and then they're going to have a new one, a different one on the right side here. So we'll talk about the general, we'll talk about some general effects, and then we'll go into spec builds for each of them. So what's unique about Death Knight? Why would you pick a Death Knight in general outside of the talent tree? They are one of the only melee in the game that have a ranged interrupt. Most melee have to go in and use their interrupt at close range. They are the masters of anti-magic. They're very good at anti-magic, and they have several things in the tree that allow them to deal with it. The first one is anti-magic shell. This is a self bubble. You put this on, you've probably seen this green bubble on a Death Knight before. And then they also have anti-magic zone, which puts a giant bubble on the ground. Anyone standing in it takes less damage from magic. So they're really good at dealing with magic and dealing with magical enemies. The other thing that they have that's very unique that no other class has is Death Grip, which I can't really show you with target dummies here, but what it does is it brings a target to you. So this is your Death Grip here. So as I said before, they are quite slow, but they be able to yank an enemy to them. This does double as a taunt for the most part for tanks as well. And then what's cool is Blood can do an AoE mass Death Grip, which pulls all of the enemies in, which is super cool. So being able to pull mobs to you is very unique. They're also one of the sturdier melees in the game. You know, you have rogues can dodge things, enhancement shamans can self-heal, but for the most part, they don't have a hybrid off-heal spec. Death Knights are pretty sturdy. Death Strike has always been one of the best healing abilities for a damage class in the game. It's super strong. And it will be available for every one of the specs, which is cool. And the other thing you're going to need to know about is the dual resource system for Death Knight. So when this first came out with Wrath of the Lich King, this was pretty new. We didn't really have a dual resource system at the time, but it's core to the class itself. So all 3 specs rely on this. So you can imagine most classes have 1 resource to deal with. They have other options available, and some classes do have dual. But for the most part, they are the premier class that has the dual resource. And what I mean by that is they have both runes, which you can see down here underneath my target here. You have runes, and then you have runic power, which is your pseudo mana bar here, your other resource. So generally how this works is you will spend runes. You see those runes went on cooldown, and that gave me runic power. For the most part, spending runes will give you runic power, otherwise, unless it's a longer ability. But you can spend those runes to get runic power, and then you can spend that runic power on abilities that consume runic power. The one caveat there is that there can't be more than 3 runes cooling down at once. So if we spend them all, you can see that only 3 of these runes are recharging. So as with any game that has a dual resource system, you get into this rhythm of spending runes and spending runic power and going back and forth. And that's what I mean by they're more strategic. They're not super fast. They don't zoom around. They bring enemies to them, and then they manage putting their runes on cooldown, spending runic power, making sure they have runes when they need them for like the right moment to use an ability that requires runes, and then making sure they have runic power to spend on that as well. So that is the core gameplay for Death Knight. Some things to be aware of in the class tree over here. The first one is going to be A-Bomb Limb. This is a Necrolord ability that we got in Shadowlands. Super cool. Again, we'll be able to see the pulls with the target dummies, but when you activate this, every 4 seconds it will pull in targets, and it does AoE, and it looks super cool. Probably one of the more visually attractive Shadowlands abilities that we got. I think there was a nerf recently in PvP that made it so this won't drag the same person, but it still works in PvE for drags, and you're gonna want to use it for leveling just because it's a nice AoE ability. You can get mobs grouped up, especially if you're gonna be leveling as Blood, where you'll do giant big pulls. The A-Bomb Limb helps a lot, and it's part of your core tree. Again, we talked about Anti-Magic Shell and Anti-Magic Zone. This is usually a group or raid ability since it affects the whole group. But you will want Anti-Magic Shell. Super nice for casters, mobs that you're killing along the way to level up. Super important. It is good to have Raise Dead on almost all the specs. Unholy uses it the most, but it is nice to have Raise Dead while you're leveling. It's another target that can pull aggro. It gives you a little extra damage for free while you're leveling, which is super nice. Some CC you'll want while leveling is going to be Blinding Sleet. It's super cool that this ended up being in the class tree, but this is just an AoE disorient, kind of like Dragon's Fire or Dragon's Breath. Pretty useful, short cooldown, 1 minute, and it slows them when they're done, when the CC breaks. And then Asphyxiate is also really nice. Single target ranged stun. So if you need to stun a mob, if it's not like if it's stunnable mob and you can stun them, take less damage while leveling, that's also super nice. Then defense-wise, you'll want Icebound Fortitude. This is kind of like their self-defense ability. It's 3 minutes, and it does 30% damage reduction, which is always good. But it also grants immunity to stun effects as well. So that can be super useful if you're fighting a mob that stuns. There's some that in Waking Shores that knock up and then stun, and being able to avoid that stun with Icebound can be kind of useful while you're leveling. Remember, you have Path of Frost for walking on water. You also have more movement speed at the start of Death's Advance for the first few seconds as it slows down. Another big thing is going to be Death and Decay. And it's cool that they made this core. So all specs will be able to do this. When you have Death and Decay down, which is your AoE, you can drop it on the ground. For each spec, one of your abilities will do AoE while you are standing in it. It's up to 7 targets, I believe. 1 additional for Obliterate, but for Unholy and for Blood, they get a lot more AoE. So if you have Death and Decay up and you are playing specifically Unholy and Blood, but Frost still gets a little bit of cleave from it, which is nice, you'll be able to get some nice cleave on that for AoE. The other thing I recommend is something that I recommend for anything that it doesn't have to be perfectly placed. I do recommend getting a cast on cursor macro. What this does is that if you cast Death and Decay with this macro, with the at cursor precursor here, it means that it won't have a ground targeter, which is super nice. So if you use it without, you have to click it once, target the location, and press it again, and that gives you the location. But for Death and Decay, I do recommend running a cast macro or a cursor macro, which means that if I use the macro, I'm holding my cursor right here, I just drop it, it's instant, it's super casual, it feels really good. So I would recommend that if you are, if you're playing Death Knight. Now let's go through each of the 3 specs. We'll talk about things that are unique to those specs, some things to be aware of, give you basic rotation, and then I'll give you a build that you can import into your game for that spec for leveling specifically. Starting with Blood, the tank spec. I think that leveling as a tank is the most casual, laid-back way you can do it, because you basically can't die. You just run and you grab every mob in sight, you pull them all together, and you AoE them down. Blood is super good at this. They're probably the second or third highest tank damage, especially AoE tank damage, which is really nice. So it's a very easy, fun, casual leveling experience to just go as a tank, pull everything in sight, kill it all, and that's how that's going to work. Just like all Death Knight specs, they do have 6 runes and runic power. So you'll be dealing with that, building up your runic power and spending it. But they have some really nice AoEs built in here that are super useful. Blood Boil being one of them. You deal damage. It's a 6.5 second recharge. Very short. It's under 10 seconds depending on what your gear is. But you will deal damage to all targets and infect them with Blood Plague, which you can combo with later. But it's a super nice way to just pop and a pop, and you can throw down Death and Decay, and you've got all this nice AoE that's just pull the mobs together. You can remember you can death grip them into you. You do have the mass grip as well, which can be nice. And then you can just go to town killing everything. If you're at range and you need to pull, you have many options. You can use Taunt, obviously, your Dark Command. Trigger the mob, bring them in, and you just go grab all the mobs you can. You can also use Death Coil at a distance, which is nice. Death Grip is also very nice on top of that. And then you can also use things like Death's Caress, which is ranged as well. So you can pull a whole bunch of mobs in, and then again, just bring in Blood Boil, burn them all down. And you also want to get the Mass Grip, Gorfine's Grasp, as you move down here towards level 61, 62. Pick that up, and you can use that to just suck in all the enemies. And I would recommend going down to Bloodshot, because your biggest weakness as leveling as a tank is just dealing damage. You can go to Bone Storm. Doesn't really do all that much damage, to be honest with you, but it is useful for tanking. I would just recommend just getting some basic damage, like go down Gorfine's Grasp and pick up these 3 here, just to help you clear mobs, and that's it. The core of how your defense functions is around your Bone Shield, which you get from Morrowind. It takes 2 runes. So you want to get up your Morrowind, you can build it, it'll give you runic power too, and it'll give you stacks of Bone Shield. Every time you use Morrowind, you'll get Bone Shield. It says it on the ability how many you have, and you can see it in your buff markers as well. It gives you a little bit of haste and some armor. What I'd recommend is you probably, for leveling, just need to hover around 5 or 6 stacks, which will give you that nice little defense, a little bit of haste, which is cool. You don't really need to go all that much higher. Just make sure that you're paying attention to it, and you're stacking up your Bone Shield as high as you can get, which is super cool. And then the way you combo with that is Tombstone. I would recommend this while leveling. It's a nice little bonus. When you activate Tombstone, which is a 1-minute cooldown, you consume 5 of those charges, and then you gain runic power and absorb damage. So super cool. You can get up, see we have 10 right now. We can pop Tombstone. We just drop down 5. And now we have this nice shield around us. Keeps us healthy, keeps us alive, and it fills up your runic power, which you can then use on spenders to get a little extra bonus damage as well. If you're looking for the basic rundown of how Blood Death Knight works, you're going to be pulling things together. Make sure you're standing on your Death and Decay, this AoE here, and then you'll be using Blood Boil for AoE. And you have a couple things to juggle and manage, and this is similar when you start doing harder content at level 70, but the general idea is make sure you're maintaining stacks of Bone Shield. Make sure you have exactly 3 runes recharging at all times. And that's how the dual resource system comes in. Make sure you're not capped on runic power, so you don't hit 100 and stay at it too long. Make sure you're not, you don't have runes that are sitting full. Make sure you always have 3 recharging, so you're at max on that. You always have those going, and then make sure you always have around at least 5 or 6 Bone Shield charges at all times. And so as you're pulling, paying attention to that, that's kind of the core gameplay loop that you'll be doing, and then you'll be doing more of that as you get higher. The next thing to think about is to play around your dancing rune weapon. This is kind of when your gameplay changes. So you, for a 2-minute cooldown, you summon a floating weapon, which is super cool, super neato. You pop this up. Here's your dancing rune weapon. And while this is active, it mirrors your melee attacks, makes you stronger, and you get 40% parry. So you're tankier, but every time you attack, they will attack as well, which is super nice. And you can modify it further, and you get 2 of them, whatever. But this is kind of like your big cooldown. So when you do your big, huge pulls, you obviously have your defenses like Icebound, but when you are ready, you can bring it all together and then play around Dancing Rune Weapon, because that's when you're going to get your big boom boom pull damage. So pull medium amounts when it's down, when you have cooldowns up for defenses, and then when you have it, that's kind of your big damage spender moment. And that covers Blood Death Knight. There's a lot more to go through when you start getting into M+ and Raid, but for the most part, this is all you really need. I will have this link down below. When you get this, you just hit import, copy, paste this in here, give it a name, and you'll have yourself a nice little build, which is super cool. So there you go, easily into it. You can use that for leveling. Let's go on to Frost Death Knight. As we talked about, Frost DK is kind of your big bursty. They have big hits. We got Sindragosa's, flying down, which is cool. It's called Frostborn's Fury now. But this one is very cool. I like this one a lot. This one is the big dragon attack. It's one of the premier things we've had for Frost DK for a while, and it is gorgeous. It's fun. It does a lot of damage. You can also run with a Breath of Sindragosa ability here, which is like a breath in front of you. But they have decent AoE, good control. They're able to do lots of really cool things, and it really kind of brings the class together. I would say it's probably not as sustainable as Unholy or Blood for leveling, but it's still super fun. I think they're all relatively similar when it comes to leveling speed. Your core abilities are Spending with Frost Strike, and you have Obliterate for spending runes, you have Howling Blast for range, and you have good AoE on top of that. And then you have some really cool cooldowns like Pillar of Frost that will build up your strength based on spending runes inside of it. And you just have some really cool combos that really kind of bring the class together. So when you're playing Frost, especially while leveling, it's super simple. So we already know that when you spend runes, you get runic power, and then you'll be able to do damage and AoE. And there's some nice procs built into the tree here that will cause those both to build. But you're spending runes with Obliterate. This is kind of your core ability for Frost. Spend runes with Obliterate, and then when you have procs for your Howling Blast with Rhyme, when you cast Obliterate, it'll give you proc sometimes. There we go, we just got a proc. Use the Howling Blast with proc, which is nice, and then always spend runes with Obliterate because there's some good efficiency with using runes to get free procs of Howling Blast, which is nice. And then when you have runic power and you full up, you either spend that with Frost Strike if it's single target, boom. If it's not single target and there's AoE, you have Glacial Advance down here as well. So that's super nice. So you can basically use Glacial Advance for AoE, proc, Obliterate, Howling Blast, Obliterate, Howling Blast. If it's single target, you Frost Strike. If you don't, you do AoE. And then you have your big ultimate abilities. You can pop Pillar of Frost. You can pop Frostborn's Fury, bring out Sindragosa, do those extra little bits there. And then you basically got to be trying to maintain Remorseless Winter as best you can. So this is going to be your AoE as you proc it. It's kind of like an immolation frost effect. Looks really cool. You got that going on. And then you're also, as you're leveling, you're going to be coming down here to Icebreaker and Everfrost. Gives you a little bit more damage, and it stacks up to single target. Everfrost is what allows you to use Remorseless Winter to even kill boss mobs, because it'll start stacking up more and more damage if it stays on the same target for long periods of time. And that's basically it. It's super simple when leveling. There's some min-maxing when later on endgame content as you start managing your runes and your cooldowns better and getting your right windows. But it is super satisfying. Lots of nice procs. You got some nice ranged as well. If you really want to play around with it, you got that going. And make sure that you pop your Pillar of Frost if you're going to be using the cooldown. Spend your runes inside of it for extra strength bonus. And that's it. If you're looking for a build, you can take this leveling build. You can copy it, import it directly into the game here with this talent spec. Hit import, type it, it's down in the description. Give it a name. You got yourself a leveling spec here for Frost DK. Lastly, let's cover my favorite DK spec, Unholy. I like Unholy a lot. It has gone through many changes over the years from its first iteration, but I think the way it is now, this is probably the best it's been since Legion. And I say that about some, like, maybe 5 or 6 of the specs that really kind of came into their own. I think that there were some really cool aspects in Shadowlands, but I think that the way these talent trees ended up being is super cool. I also think that leveling with Unholy is really fun because you have a lot of AoE. And then, like I said before, you can get some, Outbreak allows you to spread dots. You can detonate Festering Wounds, which is really cool. And then you have all these really crazy, you can summon a giant army, Army of the Dead. You can summon gargoyles. And you have some really cool ways to kind of build up your little minion army and pull mobs and do bursting AoE, which is fun. Your minion cooldown is Dark Transformation. This will make your summoned minion become all big and strong, and you can get some burning damage out of that, which is really nice. It's a pretty short cooldown, so I would just be using this every time it's up while you're leveling. And then there's going to be a different rotation for playing with AoE or single target. And I would personally save. There are ways you'll reduce Army of the Dead cooldown as you go along. It's a long cooldown until you reduce it. But I would use Army of Dead only when you really have a big pull or you're killing an elite that might be tough. and then otherwise just manage using your summon that you can transform, use summon gargoyle as well, and then you're going to be running with Apocalypse as well, which is nice. You will add wounds with Festering Strike. This will give Festering Wounds. You want to try and get 4 wounds or so, and then you can detonate that with Scourge Strike or detonate it with Apocalypse if Apocalypse is ready. And this will give you a small army, which is for regular killing. For pulling, you'll just use the same thing as, you can still taunt, so you can taunt, but the biggest thing is going to be using Outbreak. When you pop Outbreak, it'll spread disease to the target and any nearby targets to bring them all in. I do recommend running Unholy Blight as well. This will hit the target and then affect them with Virulent Plague, which is nice, which can stack up as well. So you can get extra stacks on that. And then once you have the target on Festering Wounds, by spamming Festering Strike to spend your runes, and you'll see the Festering Wounds they have on top of it. Pop it with Scourge Strike, which will give you a nice little boom, 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 give you some little bonus damage there. Or if you are using Apocalypse, you can use that to detonate the wounds as well. Remember that when we have Death and Decay, and you're standing on it, so the Death and Decay gets placed down here. When you're standing in it, your Scourge Strike will hit up to 7 enemies nearby. And we know the Scourge Strike detonates the Festering Wounds. So super cool. You can activate it. Boom. Pop it. Oh, I just lost it. Pop it. Wait for the runes to come back. There we go. So then you can pop wounds. Festering Strike will hit multiple targets. You get some really cool build up there. Then for AoE, you also have Epidemic. You can run this. I do recommend running it. This means that when you use it, which costs runic power, so you're basically using Epidemic to spend in AoE, and then you're using your Death Coil to spend in single target. Although Unholy does have a way to have that spread to an additional target. So 2, you can use Death Coil if you like, or you can use Epidemic for AoE. So you can spread, build up some runic power. Then when you use Epidemic, anyone that has the Virulent Plague on them, it'll do bonus damage, and it'll increase the duration of your Dark Transformation. So if you have your gamer up and you're popping, you can get some damage on that and build it. Like I said, it's super fun to do AoEs with this. You're standing on top of it, your Scourge Strike will cleave, your pet will cleave. If you have a Gargoyle up, you'll get some nice single target damage out of that. You'll get a nice little ultimate you can pop, get your army ready to go. And then as you're leveling, keep in mind that I do recommend getting Sudden Doom at least, because you'll get this constantly. But your auto attacks have a chance to make your Death Coil or Epidemic cost nothing. So as you're auto attacking, I literally just got it as I walked up. You can see these are glowing. It means I'm going to get a free shot of those, which is good. You pump it out, and then I would recommend getting Rotten Touch as well. As you level, Sudden Doom causes your next Death Coil to also increase your Scourge Strike damage to the target. But remember, you can get 2 targets for Death Coil. You can pop down Death and Decay. And then you can spend and get bonus damage on that as well, which is really nice. So some really cool synergy for Unholy. If you're looking for this build, it'll be down in the description. Just copy the string, import it, put it in here, give it a name. You've got yourself a build. And that is Death Knight. I think they're probably one of the easier leveling. They're definitely not the fastest, but they're very casual. They have lots of healing. Oh, I didn't mention this, but Dark Succor is another thing as well. When you kill an enemy that yields experience or honor, your next Death Strike is free and heals for more HP. So basically, as you're leveling, kill an enemy, Death Strike. Kill an enemy, Death Strike. And you just keep using that over and over. It's available for all the specs. You'll be able to keep up with that. And then you just have, depending on what spec you decided to play, you'll have a build, you'll have a way to play, and that is it. So that's Death Knight. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like, comment down below. And if you'd like to see more guides from me on World of Warcraft or any game, let me know what you'd like. I would probably want to do an M+ guide for all classes, and then a raid guide for all classes, and then maybe even some advanced guides as well. But right now we're trying to get through all the starter guides. Thanks for tuning in. Come by my stream if you have any questions, twitch.tv/Drybear. I'll see you then. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.